Hi, today is August 17th, 2017. We are in Marina del Rey, California. I am Matthew Worley, along with Michael Brockman and Randy West, also off camera, and we are all members of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. With the slate on, let us begin by saying thank you so much for taking time to share your memories.
Thank you for inviting me, and I had a pleasure getting here, and I'm sure we'll have fun as we move ahead.
In beginning, may I ask what was your full legal name at birth?
Michael Stephen Brockman.
And what was your birth date?
November 19th, 1938.
Okay, what were your 1938? So no TV in those days. At least no big
No
time.
TV in those days.
At least no
trust
big
me.
time, meaningful, real
None.
broadcast TV. So experimental things and stuff, local things maybe. So, what is your first memory of radio?
Well, I will preface the answer to that by saying I was an only child. I am an only child, and in my early years, I found a great love with the radio and listening to the music. This would have been somewhere in my, I don't know, 9, 10, 11-year period, something like that. I don't know the exact, can't remember a moment, but I remember those early years falling in love with the disc jockeys and the music. And I just found such pleasure in that and enjoyment in that. And in a way, I kind of said, I kind of think I'd like to do something in this industry. I don't know if I can't call it a moment of epiphany, but it was just a general feeling that I had in that period of time of my life.
Now, I'll note this because you've mentioned music. You specifically mentioned music and disc jockeys as opposed to like entertainment type drama programs or comedy as a kid. You have a great love of, as I've learned from knowing you, of what I would call traditional pop or pop standards or jazz standards or the Great American Songbook.
Great American standards and jazz, some
So,
jazz, not as deeply as the standards.
Yes. So with that in mind, what sorts of radio stations and what sorts of personalities do you recall listening to in those early days in New York? Great pop music in those days.
Oh my goodness! In no particular order, Martin Block, who's a famous disc jockey in New York. William B. Williams, of course, was my favorite. And whom else can I remember? It's just a variety of names that are popping through my head, so I don't, without dwelling on it. Those were the two that sort of popped mostly in my head. But
so when, because again we said 1938, so when television first appears, how old are you when you first had a television in your home, or when you first remember seeing television at friends' homes?
Early days of television. Yeah, I lived in an apartment house in Brooklyn, and one of my friends got a television set. I think it was a 10-inch, if I remember correctly. And I used to go up every once in a while in the evening to watch Milton Berle or one of the other shows in those early years. It was like a big thrill. I mean, it was I will analogize what the television set was to what happened with the iPhones and the cell phones, I should say, in general. It was that kind of an excitement and a breakthrough and experiences. It was just a lot of fun.
So I understand that your first interest as far as being involved in broadcasting was an interest in radio, if I understand correctly, from some things I've heard you say outside of this conversation. When do you first think, I'd like to meaningfully be a part of this?
Well, what happened is I graduated from high school in Bethpage, Long Island. I spent my first 2 years of high school in Brooklyn and my latter two on Long Island. And I loved it out there. I loved it. I lived in it was called Plainview, Long Island, but went to the Bethpage High School. And my plan was to go to college, and I had envisioned going to a school in upstate New York called Ithaca for a very specific reason, but I'll come back to that. But when I graduated from high school, unfortunately, my dad was quite ill. He had a heart attack, and so we really had to move back to Brooklyn, and I had to abandon the plans to go to college, and I had to try and find work to help support the family. And in the process of our moving back to Brooklyn, we were temporarily housed in a hotel while my mom looked for an apartment for us. And I remember this one Sunday morning sitting out on a deck outside the room that we had, opening up the New York Times and looking through the want ads. And all of a sudden, there is an ad for ABC. I opened up the New York Times, and there is an ad from ABC looking for mailboys. And my eyes lit up, and I said, that's it. Now wait, there's a further coincidence about this. Sometimes luck and timing are intricately important in our courses of our lives. I went in for an interview, and it turned out that the head of the mailroom who did the interview, his daughter had just graduated with me from Bethpage High School. And I did know her, not that well. But so, it probably helped me a little bit. I don't know how much, but in any event, it got me into the mailroom. I was there for about 9 months, I think 6 to 9 months. And what that did, of course, is gave you, if you used your brains and your eyes and looked around you, you got a chance to go through every crack, every corner of the building and seeing what's going on. And it became a great education. I remember going into the control rooms of the radio dramas that was still being produced and the various disc jockeys. By that time, Martin Block was there at ABC, and a number of other personalities. And I ended up getting promoted into a job as a clerk working for the program director at WABC Radio. And the job was, it's amazing how things have changed. In those days, there was a requirement that every radio station submit logs of everything that went on the air to the FCC. And they were on huge sheets in which the information had to be put on it in chronological order. Every time the show starts, every commercial started, when it ended. And the raw data was on what they call top sheets from the radio directors. I was the person who had to gather all those top sheets and transpose it onto these long sheets in which you were not allowed to make a single mistake. If you made a mistake, you had to tear up the page and start from the top. And they were about 9 months behind in doing the logs. So I got to work, and I started, and eventually I caught up with the backlog of material and the current material. And then I started helping the continuity director in the preparing of copy for the various announcers and so forth, for the breaks and for the shows. And it opened up a whole other door for me in doing as much as I could do and much as I could learn. And then came a moment of epiphany. I was there for about 2 years. Not quite, maybe a year and a half to 2. And I was sitting at a desk in a large office of individuals who had desks at the office in various places there. And I was at the back of the room. My back was to the back wall. And I remember on this day, I looked out over the backs of the heads of all of the radio salesmen that were there working. And they all had college degrees. And I said to myself, if I don't pick myself up and go to college now, I'm going to be sitting at this chair for a long time. And so I made the decision to, by that time my dad had gotten better, and so things from a family standpoint allowed me to do it. And I wanted to go to Ithaca College because there are a number of good schools around. Emerson, there was NYU, Syracuse University. The one thing that Ithaca had was, because of its location at the bottom of 4 hills, or hills that surrounded the city, there was no television coverage other than by cable. The only way you could get television. And the cable operator allowed the college to cut in once a week and go on the air. So I said to myself, good practical training. So that was the transition.
And Ithaca has a relationship, an association with many broadcasters and creative people. And maybe that's the reason why it did. I don't know. I wasn't aware of that. We mentioned in an email that I asked you if Rod Serling, who taught there, had ever been there when you were there, and you said at least one time you recall him being on campus.
I remember one class he lectured, one lecture that he gave in one of my classes. I cannot remember the detail of it, quite frankly. But
are there any other notable media personalities with whom you interacted during that time that you do remember?
There at Ithaca?
Yes.
There was an interesting, not an on-camera performer, but a news director of a number of local stations. Eventually, he was a teacher then named Ted Kavanaugh, who was a very interesting guy and was the television expert, if you will. And I can remember, and of course, part of our training, we had to do all of the various jobs at one time or another in radio or television. There was a local, they had a FM radio station that the college had license to use, and they also, we set up an AM station to go to the dormitories, and which was also some good training. And I realized at one time, and I'm going to come back to your point about personalities, I decided that I said, you know, I would bet that I could get some advertisers to sponsor some of this, reaching a couple of dorms of college students. We would make a lot of money, but we weren't making money that wasn't for that purpose. And I went to the head of the department, and I said, I'd like to go out and see if I can get some business for the stations. And I explained the situation to him, and he looked at me like I was out of my mind. Within a week, it came back with an order for about a couple of $1,000 from a dry cleaning firm, because there was no laundry facilities at the two colleges, and so they had to bring their laundry somewhere. And so I agreed to set up my room as the central point for delivery of the laundry and so forth, and service them. And we got, I don't know how many spots and all that encountered, but it was my first. And when I walked in with that contract for the couple of $1,000, the guy almost fell off his chair, the head of the department. And going back to what you were saying, though, there are a number of personalities who have done very well at Ithaca College over the years, but I don't think there were any other. Oh, it's one. Well, how could I do this? This is terrible. My roommate, a fellow named Bill Deal, who was a news announcer at WNEW New York, among other stations. He was an entertainment reporter for ABC Radio for a number of years. So he and I, it started out as 4 roommates together, eventually narrowed down to 3, and then Bill and I were there for the last year together.
It's interesting you talk about, you saw these salesmen who had college degrees, and you realized that you needed to go and further your education. I think, maybe I'm wrong, I think that if you wanted a sales job today at a radio station, they'll take anybody off the street anywhere, anytime. If you'll try to sell something and you'll hustle, they'll give you a shot at least, right? It's interesting that in those days, even the sales staff were people of a higher education than average.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, it's the only frame of reference that I had, okay? Everything was a little more formal in those days than it was now. And here you were at a 50,000 watt station, home of the network. So, and well, also I will just mention was an education for me. It was at a point of transition in which the station was moving from being the sort of pass through of the network programs to a more independent life as a top 40 music station. So I was there when Alan Freed came over from WINS, and a number of other personalities, Bruce Morrow, and it was a great education for me. That's all I can say. I look back at those years with great fondness.
These were the final days of traditional network radio, the final fading days of that. When you entered into this, the desire to be involved in the media business, because you're talking about selling and things, did you see and because you rose to a high level as an executive, did you see yourself as an aspiring performer, executive, salesman? Did you think all of it was fascinating?
I was in love with the business, okay, but we do have to judge ourselves, okay. And I remember at Ithaca, when I first had to direct my first show, it took me about 20 seconds to realize this was not my career, not being a television director. That I realized quickly. So you begin to eliminate, things you either gravitate to because you have a skill at it or you don't. You can appreciate the importance of it, but may not have been for me. And so I just found myself, I was a disc jockey. I was a disc jockey there at the college. I also got a job at the local radio station which had a couple of interesting talents. No one that was nationally known. Well, one fellow named Chet Curtis, who was a broadcaster in Boston for many years as a news anchor with his then wife, was a student at Ithaca for the time. There were a couple other guys who moved on. Oh God, I'm blanking on his name. Tom Saunders, his fellow's name, was a disc jockey out in San Francisco, very successful, and in Buffalo, New York. There were students there at one time or another, and so the atmosphere was a very creative one without my realizing that it was. But it was a more formal, the profession and the settings at certainly the major stations that I was fortunate enough to work on was a little more formal.
You were kind enough, as have been a couple of subjects with whom we've chatted for this series, to help me, and I'm grateful to you by giving me some career highlights as far as chronology, which helped my research. You say in this list of highlights, during the following 4 years, meaning following your entrance into college, you served as night program manager in the staff announcer office.
Yes.
By that, do you mean the
I'll
office
explain.
at ABC or the
Yes.
one at the college?
No. At ABC. In other words, having worked at ABC for the 2.5 years before I went to college, I was able to maintain a relationship there with various people. And when it came time to summer employment, I went back to ABC. And what they found was a job that they needed during the summers, working in the staff announcer office. Okay, there were about 23 staff announcers from Milton Cross, to Don Gardner, to a whole roster of really very well-known, very successful, interesting personalities. But what my job was scheduling the announcers to the various studios that they needed to be at, either at the local radio station or the network radio operation or local television or network television, doing all the breaks and so forth. And that was part of the job. And also, I was what is called night program manager. I was management in charge of the 4 divisions: local radio, network radio, local television, and network television, from the hours of like 6 o'clock at night till 1 o'clock in the morning. So that if there were any emergencies of any kind, I would have to be the point person to start bringing people in to whatever was needed.
Well, now you're, by my math, you're 21, 22, something like that.
Forget. Let's see. 22.
Okay. So we go from, I'm sitting here looking at these salesmen to which I aspire, or a position to which I aspire. I've got to get out of here and go to college. We go from that to, you have a management, it's not a high-level management role, but you have a management role as a very young man, supervising a large number of people. How did that evolution happen?
Well, I don't want to overstate this. There was a person in charge during the day who was really the person in charge of the staff. But this was like the night program situation, and if somebody didn't show up, you have to scramble to get somebody. It was really there just to see to it that everything got on the air smoothly as best as you could, to the degree that the announcers were a part of that process. So it was. I built some lifelong friends through it. Others that were in the job at one point or another, and even till today. No, that would be my college roommate. Are there any? Yeah, but I'm still friendly with a few that we were very close to starting in those years. A couple have passed away, but but to get back to one point to your question, it was an exciting, responsible position, but I loved the hell of it, and it was a great learning experience for me.
But we have Randy West here off camera, as we mentioned, who's a very accomplished announcer in the classic sense of the term announcer. And of course, this is an interest of mine too, although I'm not an announcer. But this was not your career background, but you're working with these people. And this is in the days when there was someone in the booth all the time. Are there any eccentricities or interesting anecdotes about dealing with those people?
We haven't got enough time. I forgot to mention one thing that would be additive to this picture. While I was working at ABC before I went to college, I attended a school in New York called the School of Radio Technique, and it was a class on announcing training. And the fellow who was the teacher of the class and forgive me, but I am forgetting his name. I can picture him. He was the former head of the announcing staff at NBC for many years, a wonderful old Irishman. And he would sit there pontificating and beating us up when we were wrong. There were about 9 of us in the class. And I mean, it was an unbelievable experience in learning how to read copy and how to prepare copy and how to mark copy and the different aspects of announcing and so forth. So it was it's what inspired me a little bit in the announcing as well. And so it also was something, the information that in the learning experience that was, I was able to bring to the table with regard to my interaction with all the various announcers. And really appreciate the skill that they had.
You mentioned wanting an anecdote or two. Maybe we can fish one out if I mentioned
Sure.
George Ansborough.
George? Oh, I remember George very well. Wonderful, wonderful gentleman.
Fred Foy.
Fred, delightful Fred Foy, the voice of the Lone Ranger. Yes, but a great announcer on his own and a really great chap. I mean, again, my interacting with these guys was more on a social level there in the office, because my desk was in the office, and that's where all the announcers gathered, going to and from their assignments. It was like their lounge.
You were there with Danning and Rick Sklar. Could you give us
Rick Sklar, no. Rick Sklar was there after I left to go to college.
Mike Joseph?
No, I don't think I knew him. Don't think so.
Dan Ingram?
Met Ingram, but they were there after the times that I was working these assignments. I dealt more with the staff announcers, not the personalities that were doing the shows. Martin Block eventually did meet. He was there while I was still working. Before I went to college, he was there at ABC.
Al Lohman?
Al Lohman, I knew Al. Herb Oscar Anderson was another name that I actually worked for Herb while I was there. I used to go in early in the morning to work with him there in the studio, and I was the one that was doing all the record picking of the new records that came out. I had a very cooperative director who was willing to let me do it. Some of the other personalities. Bob Eberly, famous singer, who was a disc jockey at WABC for a few years.
I didn't realize Eberly had worked as a disc
Yeah.
jockey. We think of him as Green Eyes
Right,
and all those
right.
things, but yeah. How
And
interesting.
again, a delightful fellow. A fellow named Ted Lawrence, who was also very good, was a staff announcer. Ed Jordan, I remember very well. Another announcer, Chet Gould.
Chet Gould.
Joel Krager.
Did some game shows himself
Yes, he
later.
did.
Yes.
Yes, he did.
Yes.
Joel was a very wonderful fellow. Oh, God. They were all, Milton Cross, the voice of the Metropolitan Opera.
Mm-hmm.
Also a very soft-spoken, easy individual. It was always odd having to have, and we usually try to avoid it, having Milton Cross having to do station breaks on WABC doing rock and roll radio.
Incongruous.
A bit.
You get out of college, and the first thing you do here, it says, I started my career, although it was already underway, of course, as an assistant account rep. So you thought of those men as salespeople, and
No.
now you're...
No.
That's not
I
right.
understand why you would draw that conclusion.
That's not what it means.
That's
Okay.
not what it meant. I came back to ABC after I started college in February, so my official graduation wasn't until June of 1963, but I actually had finished school in the end of January 1963. So when I came back to ABC in February, I'm here, and I was looking for a job in radio. And they said, "We don't have a job in radio, but we do have a job in television if you're interested." I said, "What is it?" And once the explainer was, I said, "Absolutely, I'll take it." And what it was is in the station clearance department. In those days, I can't tell you today how it works. I'm sure it is nothing like this anymore with all the computerization that has grown. But our jobs, we individually had individual shows that we had to clear with the television affiliates across the country. You had to book the show. You have the station responses as to whether they want to clear it or not, try and change their minds if they weren't, because in those days ABC did not have the equal advantage to NBC and CBS. They didn't have as many stations. They equalized them in the top 30 markets, but once you got past the top 30 markets, many of the shows had to be aired in the fringe time periods of the CBS or the NBC affiliate. So that was what the job was, but it had a label of an assistant account rep.
This is like getting affidavits, or the modern sense of affidavits, to show you aired this or you didn't, and all those things.
Well, it was more in terms of trying to just build the lineup for the show in order for it to maximize its getting a decent rating. You know, you don't go in the market, you get a 0 rating for that market. Goes into the average and doesn't help.
Sure. And of course, as you've noted, ABC was very much an also-ran network in those early days.
It was struggling.
Yes. So, do you think, I haven't thought of this till now, do you suppose that your ability as a young man to rise so dramatically as you did in the early days had anything to do with the fact that it was ABC and it wasn't NBC or CBS that had perhaps more competition for jobs there and more established?
I will answer it this way. No, I don't. I never thought of it that way. And I would tend to think that the movement was probably greater than it probably is today. Things are a little more structured today. But I don't think so. I think it just had to do with opportunity and a little bit of luck. I really do.
1964, promoted to the assistant to the vice president of program administration. What was that job?
Okay. I had said to you that there were a group of fellows who became friends in those early years at the night program manager job. And one of the other fellows was worked in the newsroom as a copy boy. And there were about 4 of us who were very close. And this one friend who was at one point the copy boy was a very aggressive individual. He was always looking out, and we always looked to Alan as the one who was really going to succeed. And he ended up getting into this job as an assistant to the vice president of administration for the ABC television network. And that serviced a whole variety of jobs, administrative jobs relative to overseeing and working for the program department personnel. And at one point, he was going to leave that job for some other job outside of ABC. And so he had arranged for me to be interviewed by his boss. So I went up to meet the fellow whom I eventually was going to work for the interview, only the secretary, who was his secretary, when I arrived at the desk, who was acting very responsible in doing of her position, said she had no record of the appointment. She can't understand it. And she got a little ruffled by that. And I was kind of intrigued by her. We eventually got married.
Oh, intrigued in the
My
romantic
first wife
sense.
for 29 years. And so I got interviewed by the fellow named Leonard Maskin and ended up getting hired. And the fellow who was leaving the job, we had agreed on a Saturday that I would come in and he would come in and we would go through a number of the activities that needed to be done, which was the extent of my break-in period. So she, unbeknownst to me, the secretary, who said, "I'll come in and help." So she had her eyes on me from that day, only I did not know that. And
the ladies always choose.
Yes.
And we don't always know.
Anyway, it worked out very well, and I was in that job. I cannot remember. I would say for about a year or so, I seem to think. It's a little blurry right now exactly the precise length of time that I was there. But also it was a great learning curve because I interacted with the vice president in charge of programming, the director, a fellow named Ed Sherrick was the head of the vice president in charge of programming. His office was right around the wall from where I was. The fellow who was the head of daytime at the time, Ed Blyer, who had the distinction of being both the vice president of daytime programs and daytime sales. You want to talk about a lot of responsibility. But again, great teacher. The fellow who was the director of primetime development was a fellow named Douglas Kramer, who went on to be a big producer in television, working for Aaron Spelling and on his own. And another fellow named Len Goldberg, who has done extremely well over the years, with also many, many shows, and currently exec producer of Blue Bloods, that's been on the air for CBS for a number of years. So getting to know these folks and watching the way they work, all stuff for me to take in and absorb and try and learn from.
And it's around this time that you first become actively involved in the actual hands-on television production elements too, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
But also, one thing before that, though, is you note 1965 promoted to TV commercial coordinator. Many of
That
these
was the
jobs
transition.
are, your jobs have been kind of clearance related in one form or another, it seems, for the most part, up to this. Tell us about TV commercial coordinator.
I will. But the promotion into the assistant to the vice president of administration was the transition out of the interacting with the affiliates at that point. It happened later in a different way. Again, a group of the fellas, a couple of them who were the original group before, were one or two of them were I forget the title I used there.
You're asking about TV commercial coordinator?
Commercial coordinator, yeah.
Yes.
It was blank. Senior moment. Commercial coordinators. They were assigned to individual shows, late evening news, Father Knows Best reruns in the daytime, game shows, the integration of commercials. They would, if the shows were, they weren't on live, they were live on tape. They were commercially integrated into a composite half-hour show in those days. And our responsibility was to ascertain the scheduling of what commercials go into what spots, make sure all the material was available and accessible to the AD in the booth for the show, and to see to it that they got in properly and that the slides for the billboards that were at either the beginning or the end of the show were there, and I had to supply those. That was what that job was. Again, great learning experience going to the individual shows and seeing to it how everything worked.
So this, in a way, is the beginning of a production-type job. It's
One
production-related.
of the jobs that I ended up having was as a commercial coordinator on a daytime soap opera called The Nurses.
And as I understand, this is your first real, like, production-type job. Is that right?
Well, no, it was still as the commercial coordinator,
Okay.
but it was my introduction into the world of soap operas.
Yes.
And I had a very, very good couple of teachers there, and it was very interesting and informative. And then I did I got promoted, from the commercial coordinator job, moving on, the network began the creation of a title called unit manager. It never existed there before. And they culled or brought together individuals from the commercial coordinator job, stage managers, financial people, disparate lines of experience into this job, which was really management in charge of a show. Basically the below the line of the show.
Would this be, if I may ask you, would
Yeah.
this be equivalent to the modern term unit production manager, or is this a different job?
Similar.
Okay.
Very similar. It was the title had existed at NBC for many years. It's a production supervisor at CBS. Excuse me. And so ABC started. This was in, I believe this was around 1963. And when I saw this amalgam of people, none of whom were trained for this job, we didn't really know what the job was. I said to myself, if I take over an existing system of an existing show and it's all screwed up, I'll never know. Well, there was a new show coming on the air in a few months. So I went to the head of the department and I said, look, I've had some experience in soap opera. There's a new soap opera coming on in a few months. I want to do that. And if there's any screw up, you'll be able to point to me. But at least I'll set up my own system. It was a show called Dark Shadows, which was an unbelievably great experience. The fellow who is the executive producer of the show and the one who was responsible for it getting on the air, named Dan Curtis, had never worked a day in the studio. And I can still remember vividly the very first production meeting of the show to get the series underway. Dan and I went down to the room together. And as I was about to open the door, or just as I opened the door to this large conference room in which there were about 20 people sitting around the room waiting, Dan grabs my arm and he whispers to me, he says, "What in the fuck do all these people do?" And I said, "Well, let's start the meeting and you'll find out." Now, this is the man who went on to do Winds of War, War and Remembrance, major television events, movies for television. Unbelievably talented guy. And this was his introduction. I was there on the day of the first television show that ever he was a part of. Fascinating.
As you've noted, Curtis became very accomplished and respected and very diverse in the types of work that he did.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like you were with Shadows from day one, is
Yeah.
that right?
Oh, yes.
So because obviously so many fans of Shadows, and Shadows is also unique in that it's really the only daytime soap opera from that period that still airs, that's on DVD,
Mm-hmm.
that's almost fully extant, and that people can look at and get a sense of what production techniques and values were in those days. And they're very limited even by the
Yes.
standards of soaps today, which themselves are somewhat limited compared to other things. Having said that, though, the aesthetic, or let's say the themes of Shadows, in the beginning were fantastic, but were not quite as supernatural, not quite as macabre
It started out as a Gothic novel.
as they became
That's
later.
what the original Bible was about. Okay. And the ratings in the first 6 months were modest. And there was a great concern that it might be canceled. Dan decided to transform it into what it became, the era of the supernatural. He said, there's going to come a time they had constant reference during the first 6 months about the basement and what was going on in the basement. Okay? Never visited, never addressed other than in a very innocent, just offhand comment or two. And he said, the day is coming when we're going to go to the basement. And he got the writers together and basically started to reconstruct the show. And the rest, as they say, is history. What I would like to say, because I don't know if you'll get to it with regard to the show, it was not only unique in its setting, in its conception, but it dealt with some fascinating problems. One of the normal pattern for the soap operas in terms of script completion and delivery to the performers and for production, they usually tried to hit the scripts about a week and a half, within a week to 2 weeks prior to production. And disciplined writers were able to do that. But with Dan, he would be constantly tearing up the material and the storylines and wanting to redo them. So we used to schedule production meetings with the art director, the associate producers, the AD, about 6 or 7 of us who were critical to making the script come alive in terms of everything but the performance, obviously. But it got to the point where the production meetings became a wonderful little party because there was no scripts to discuss. So we never knew what was coming. And then I remember always getting home and when the scripts would arrive and I would read it and I would go, oh my God, how the heck are we going to do this? How are we going to do it? Because he kept calling for special effects. And there was really no basic unit to do special effects to this level. I remember one show in which we were doing a show about, I'm forgetting the name of the title, not of the character, but the type of character she portrayed, but she's a woman who came from fire and left in fire.
A Phoenix.
Phoenix, thank you. And in one of these scenes, there was supposed to be the Phoenix disappears and a cat appears, okay? Well, we never got to rehearse the scenes. And most of the show, the tapings were basically a modification of a dress rehearsal because we never gotten to do a full dress rehearsal. And when it came to doing this one particular scene, the smoke pot went off and the cat took off and is probably still running today. Because it was never... I mean, there were things like that that would go on with the show all the time. The studio itself, the the network really did not have sufficient facilities to do shows of this kind. And while the show started off in one of the main studios at 7 West 66th Street in New York, or a couple of main studios there, and this was in one of them, the eventual plan was to move it to a self-contained facility about 10 blocks away. The only difficulty with that studio was it was only 39 feet wide. And you try and cram sets and cameras and performers, and it was, I can remember numbers of times, there was Leela Swift was one of the great directors who directed the show. She was brilliant. She would be screaming, and she was a screamer, screaming into the mic to the cameraman, "Back up, back up!" And he yells quietly, "I'm against the wall, where do you want me to go?" We dealt with all kinds of bizarre circumstances like that, but it was a great challenge for us, and it was a lot of fun.
The last, I don't know, I shouldn't say the last I knew, as of fairly recently, that was still a working television production space for some talk shows and things that are much less ambitious.
Yeah, it was a warehouse that they converted into a studio.
Randy, is there anything we've missed that you throw in? Two questions about Shadows. Is it somewhere in my notes? I can't find it at the moment. I had down you were 66 to 69. Is that correct on Shadows, or does that sound about right?
66 is correct. I think it went to 1970 or 71.
Oh, it did.
It
but
did.
Did you stay with it the whole
Oh,
time?
no. I was not that whole time. I was on the show
was asking
for a
about
couple
you.
of years.
Couple of years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was on the show for about 2 years, and there was another new soap opera coming on the air. Now, this, I will tell you in advance, turned out to be a pivotal moment in my career.
Well, before we
But
transition,
you never knew it.
may I ask you one more thing about Shadows?
Yes.
Which is we never defined specifically what your role as the unit manager for that show
I'm
was.
sorry. The unit manager was responsible for the scheduling of the crew, not the stage crew. That was done by someone else, another department. Scheduling the crew, the ADs, making sure that all of the elements that needed to be there were there. You were the management overseer of all of the below-the-line elements. And you had to work directly with the producer and associate producer. And it was a very similar position to the associate producer, with absent any of the interaction with the performers on a level other than socially as you're working a show. Because any one of these shows, when they're on day like that, everybody gets to know everybody. So that it was and responsible for the budgeting on the show and the maintenance of the budgeting on the show, and tracking the expenditures of it.
This is a show that, because it was done live to tape and because it was so ambitious for its time, did have some production challenges. And I know there was a period of time when the taping schedule was cutting so close that they were down to taping just a day or two before air, some of the shows. So at least that's what I've been told by people who were involved. So with that in mind, do you have any thoughts about the evolution of this show? It's as it became such a phenomenon, as it became more and more ambitious in production sense, as it went into color, all the chroma key stuff.
God, I got chills as you said that. We were there that day, the first transformation of black and white to color, and seeing that camera come up in beautiful color, because we had no idea exactly what we were going to see. It was, everybody was in the control room to see that. It was just, you today, you just, of course, don't even think about this issue, but it was a big deal to them. It was incredible. But I must say to you, I do not remember during any of the times that I was there that the show aired that close to air. No,
Okay,
I don't remember it getting closer than a week before. But what I did do is, today the shows are shot mostly as feature films were shot, because they're hour in length, and it changed the whole nature of production. But in those days, it was shot from top to bottom. But what I did is I sat there, looked at these set elements when you lay out the shows for the week. And I see that on day 1, sets A, B, and C are used. And on day 2, sets C, D, E, and F are used. Now on Wednesday, A, B, and C are used again. So I said to them, hey, look, guys, we got problems. What if we just flip the 2 shows? And we don't have to strike and reset the sets. They're lit, they're all set. It'll save a lot of time and money. Well, genius idea. So we would start balancing the production schedule based on to what degree we could keep the sets up and not have to go through a lot of overnight transformations.
Did were you actually in the booth during the taping?
Yes.
Okay, so you were along for that whole ride of all
Oh,
those
yes.
years of Jonathan Frid and everything that happened.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Did you have any I'm bookending this, but it's something people like so much. I'm focusing on it a little bit. Did you have any thoughts on just the participation in something that was so avant-garde for its time, and perhaps was that in any way more exciting than working on a more traditional soap? Or
No, remember, this was the first time that I really got my fingers wet with regard to production, okay? So I had no real frame of reference. The commercial coordinator job was really more at a distance. I was there during the tapings of when I was commercial coordinator, but wasn't as involved in the pre-production elements of the show as needed. This I was involved from the very beginning. So I had no real comparisons to other shows. The fact that it required a real discipline on the production staff because of the hectic nature of the writing preparation of the shows was a terrific discipline. We really had to have our act together because we weren't going to get the information we needed well in advance to do it in a normal fashion. So a lot of people had to do some quick thinking to figure out how do we solve this problem in a day and a half if we know we needed something. So it was great education.
do you have any thoughts? You weren't involved in the writing, I don't suppose,
Right.
but do you have any thoughts on the fact that this show leaned so heavily on classic literary themes and was dependent on that canon for its material,
Right.
and of course over time one exhausts that canon. That's just a general
Yeah.
comment, but do you have any thoughts on that, or how that affected the evolution of the show or its eventual cancellation?
Clearly, Dan's knowledge of the classics imbued the adaptation of various of the stories of history into the show's themes in one way or another. All I know is this. When we moved to that studio on 54th Street, or 53rd, well, it spanned both streets, but 53rd, there was a school across the street, okay? And we had a young school. I think it was elementary, but I'm not sure. It might have been. There was no middle school in New York then, so it's probably an elementary school. And in the early times that we were there, when the show was still struggling, everything was very quiet. You know? When the show started its transition, all of a sudden the kids from across the street are showing up at the door of the studios. And I go, uh-oh, something's happening. Here was a microcosm of what was going on across the country. Because the show, I mean, I'll use numbers that bear no resemblance to numbers of today, but the show that had been lingering in the high teen shares to a 20, which was ABC, was sort of okay, but not great. It eventually got up to 30 shares. I mean, that was unheard of for ABC, let alone, for ABC, it's certainly at that point. So it was interesting to see that visibility of the transition, other than just through rating reports and various things you would pick up from newspaper columns. And when you realized you're all of a sudden on a fast-moving train.
You mentioned in 1970 moving on to involvement in management of daytime programming, including children's programming, but you also wanted to mention another transition you made. You started to mention it a moment ago, and I asked you to stop to get some more detail on
Yeah.
Shadows. What was that, do you
All
think
right.
you wanted to mention?
At a point, after being on Shadows for the first 2 years, there was a new soap opera that was coming up on ABC called One Life to Live. And I found out that the producer of the show was the woman who was the producer of The Nurses when I was a commercial coordinator. So I interviewed with her to being an associate producer. I felt I had learned enough that I could do that job. And she just looked at me, and she was a very, how can I say, very forceful and dominant personality. It was Doris Quinlan. She had produced The Nurses when it was in prime time and then in daytime. She was a very, very well-educated person of production. And she looked at me and she just said, "Dear boy," she said, I'm not going to hire you as an associate producer. I have Charlotte, who works for me for years, who's going to be the associate producer. I'm going to have the network put you on the show as the unit manager, and I'll have you for free. Oh, I went home and I was so furious. I was so upset. I felt I had been had. My career was over, and I tried to fight being put on the show. And my boss said to me, Michael, you're the only one qualified to do it. Come on. Well, that became the turning point in my career because it enabled me to meet Agnes Nixon, who was the creator of the show and the executive producer of the show. And unbeknownst to me, years later, I found out that one of the key reasons that I got hired as the manager of daytime programming is because she pushed me to the head of the department. And I never knew that at the time. I only found out, as I said, years later. And I had a wonderful relationship with Agnes over the years, and of course was there through all my children as well, but in the management position in daytime programs.
Now, in chatting with you today, we know you mostly as an executive at all three of the networks, mostly involved in daytime programming as a VP or something such as that. This is called Manager of Daytime Programs, including children's programming. How does that differ from the title that you had in later times in your life as Vice President of? Is it the same thing? Is this a lower level supervisory job in daytime?
Yeah, with the big difference is you don't get to choose what goes on the air.
Okay,
or what comes
so
off.
Can you explain to us, since you're not the buyer at this point,
Right.
Can you explain to us what the role is or was?
Oh my. You worked on all of the shows. Well, first of all, I had to indicate that there was a West Coast staff and an East Coast staff. So I was manager of daytime East Coast. But, had interaction with the persons on the West Coast. And it really was sitting in on development meetings and participating in the various discussions of oversight and commentary of the shows, and particularly with the soaps, which are evolving. Once a game show gets on and you get the format right, it pretty much runs its course. I don't mean that to belittle it. It was, you didn't want to fix what wasn't broken. But the serials become a very malleable thing. They're changing with some regularity. You have a long-term story to work off of and weekly outlines, but of course, as well as the daily scripts, but trying to monitor the differing performances and how various storylines are working or not working, and all of the whole creative dynamics of the process. You're in it at a lower level. There's a manager, a director, and the head of the department. And I had the very good fortune to work under a gentleman by the name of Brandon Stoddard, who became the head of prime time at ABC and was responsible for motion pictures for television, and really one of the key responsible parties for Roots and a number of other great miniseries. But he and I came together as the manager and the director at the same time in 1970. No. What am I saying? Yeah. 1970. That's when I got promoted as manager of daytime.
That's what you have here in this timeline you've helped us with. You mentioned 1972. You say promoted to director. You don't. What director of what?
Director of daytime programs.
Okay.
So
this is the advancing up the ladder,
just
the
up
hierarchy.
the ladder. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
And then in 1974, promoted to VP of Daytime Programs, which I ran for 3 years. This is, I don't know how it was in those days and how it evolved at the different networks for which you worked, but now you're in a position of supremacy in the sense of, other than the person who heads the network, you're really responsible for decisions regarding a day part, aren't you?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but by and large, yes. In other words, you are put in the position to lead the department in all of its administration, its creativity, its program supervision, and program development and scheduling. But we all have a boss, and I didn't report directly to the head of the division at the time. I had an individual whom I reported to, had run daytime before, not just before us, but at a point both at NBC and ABC, a fellow named Ed Vane, and then he reported through to the head of the department at the time, Martin Starker. But it is the distinction that occurred at that point, and I made reference to it earlier. That was the point in which the children's department separated from daytime because of the intense public relations that took place during the early 70s about the responsibility or lack thereof of the networks and children's programming, the success of Sesame Street and the Children's Television Workshop, and a few other things. I was involved in the children's area during the 4-year period from 70 until 74, but I was not the vice president of children's programs at that point in that split, but that was promoted to the head of daytimes because that was when Brandon left to go to the West Coast to do movies for television.
So, to clarify for our talking further, when you become head of VP, you become VP for daytime in 74. At that point, you are not involved with children's programming. That would come later.
For a period of time, short period of time, yes.
Okay. So, 1974, head of daytime programming, which we said does not quite include children's programming at that point. Can you give us a sense of, this a long time ago, and you worked in so many schedules over the years. Could you give us a sense of what the ABC daytime schedule was like in your memory in 74 when you first got involved? Have a memory of that? Was it game show heavy? Was it serial heavy? Was it...
The network, ABC programmed an hour less a day than CBS and NBC. I'll use Eastern Times at the moment as a reference point. It was an hour off here on the West Coast, a clock hour off, but actually 3 hour. In other words, what would start at 11 a.m. in the morning on the East Coast started at 10 a.m. in the morning Pacific time. And the schedule at that time, in 1970, my pause is not that I'm not remembering, I'm remembering, but I'm trying to fit this into some context.
You have great clarity, as I've noticed in talking with you in casual conversation. I don't
At
doubt
the
it at all.
time that I was joining the daytime program department, the then head or vice president of daytime, who was the one who hired me, had committed to 2 soap operas to go on the air simultaneously. And having seen the material that existed for both shows, I had some concerns. The fellow who hired me, I want to tell this story because I think it relates. Well, I'll just tell it. I had been trying to get into the program department to see this fellow, whom I had known through my earlier days as when I was working as the assistant to the VP of administration. He was one of the key salesmen in the department, and he was then promoted to the head of daytime, just programs. Okay, and so I was trying to get in to see him, and I couldn't get in to see him. His staff had left. There was nobody there. It was just he. There was no manager. There was no director. And one night, after I was frustrated as hell, I couldn't get in to see him. I got so frustrated from the job that the job I was doing, which was a financial production job, basically, at that point. I stopped down at his office on my way out one night, and his secretary was very, very nice. I'd known her. She sees me, and she knew that I'd been trying to reach Marshall and not getting any response. And she said, look, he's going to be down here in about 10, 15 minutes. Just go in his office and sit down. And I walked into his office, and he had this huge desktop that was filled with all of these little, like, Post-it notes, cluttered over the entire desk, which I found rather odd. And he walks in the office, and he goes, Brockman, I've been meaning to call you back. He said, just a minute, I got to take care of something. And he was a very tall, 6'4", 6'5" guy. Still friends with him today. He lives down in Florida. He reaches across the desk with his arm, and he sweeps all the notes off into the wastepaper basket. And he goes, now they're all returned. Now what did you want to talk to me about? So I knew where my notes were. It wasn't personal. It was his own manner of behavior. And so I gave a pitch for the job and told him why he needed me and what I could do. And he said, you know, Michael, he said, you may be right, but at this point, I just don't know. I really don't know what I need, and I'm still going to have to look. I left that night with a real depressed feeling. I felt that my shot was over and out. Done. I ended up getting promoted in the department that I was in to, I don't remember the title, and it's not relevant to this, but I had been promoted, and about 4 weeks later, after the promotion, I'm leaving the building one night, and the doors open up the elevator, and there's Marshall standing in the elevator. He goes, "BROCKMAN, I've been meaning to call you. Come downstairs with me." And we go down to the building. We go out into the outside at the steps. I remember this vividly, and you'll know why when I tell you the completion of it. He said, "I've been meaning to talk to you because I thought about what you said, and you're absolutely right, and I want to make you manager of daytime programs." Out of nowhere. And I said, "Marshall, I've been at this company for years. I just got promoted 4 weeks ago. My credit is going to be terrible. How do I do that?" He says, "I will handle it. You're going into the creative area." He said, "Nobody will worry. Don't worry." And he finishes the discussion about how great this is going to be. He says, "Oh, by the way, you're going to be working for a fellow who's over at Gray Advertising with the name of Brandon Stoddard, etc." And I said, "Marshall, what do you mean I'm going to be working for someone whom I haven't met and he hasn't met me?" He said, "No, I've talked to him about you." He said, "It'll be fine. You go over and meet him. You'll see what I mean." Now, all I could picture is a vice president of Gray Advertising named Brandon Stoddard, and all I could think of is another 6'5", wispy hair, really classic advertising executive.
Like patrician, waspy madman type.
Yeah. I go over to see Brandon. I bring over this material for the 2 soap operas that are going on the air. And I go in to meet him, and here is this 5'3" elf, laughing, charming, intelligent. I mean, every positive quality you want to think about. And we hit it off perfectly. Our skills complemented each other. And that's exactly what we needed. And when I felt comfortable in the discussion, I said, "Brandon, have you seen the material of the 2 new shows that are going on the air in 4 months?" And he said, "No, but Marshall's told me about it, and he said it's very, very interesting." And I said, I brought over the material for you. And I handed him the Bible for one of the shows, which was called The Best of Everything. And the creator and writer of it, Jimmy Lipton, who does, and I'm blanking on the title. Inside the Actors Studio. Thank you, Randy. Again, another brilliant creative mind, and organized to a fault. He had that Bible perfect. And I handed it to Brandon. And I said, "Now let me show you the Bible for the second show." And I took out the 1 page. That's all there was. Brandon just sat there with his mouth open, thinking I was putting him on. And I said, "No, that's it. Now you understand what we have ahead of us." Now, the causation of that was the fellow who was the head of a department was a salesman, okay? And there was a very famous writer of soap operas by the name of Erna Phillips, creator of them from day one, As the World Turns, Guiding Light. I mean, so many. He couldn't get her because she was under contract to Procter & Gamble. So he decided he would hire her daughter to be a head writer, figuring that Mama would not let her daughter fall through the cracks. So we had a major job creating a show in the process. Eventually, his anticipation of what would happen did happen, and Erna did come on and then picked up with the show. So to bring this full bore back to what you asked me about the schedule, in 1974, these 2 shows went on the air from noon to 1 o'clock. And the network moved its schedule back to 11 a.m. We had started at 12 o'clock and went to 4 originally, 4 hours a day. And now we were going to be on the air 5 hours a day. And there were 2 sitcoms, that Bewitched and That Girl, that were reruns that were running in the morning from 11 to 12. Well, oh, and also I might add that all my children had just gone on the air 3 months before. Now, parenthetically, I will say to you that the history of ratings of daytime soap operas in starting them was a programmer's nightmare, because they're very expensive and they are very hard to build or get an audience for, because the audience knows it's a serial. They're going to get hooked. They're going to have to start to watch it frequently, a couple of times a week. And didn't want to make that commitment. It's like a narcotic. So the ratings always were very, very slow. And you never knew what you were going to get. You really had to wait almost 2 years before you would find out if you had something that was going to become a success or not. Well, the idea of putting 2 new soap operas on back to back, leading into another new soap opera that had only been on 3 months, was fraught with disaster. There's no other way to say it. And the first 2 shows, one lasted a year and the other lasted 3 months. And it was a chaotic time, and the fellow who made that decision and did it, no, just to back up so there's some context to why he would do that. The soaps, when successful, were far more financially successful than the game shows. And ABC was really did not have, they had General Hospital. And at that time, One Life to Live had been on a couple of years and was a modest performer. And they really needed a build-up of new soaps. We just did it too quickly. And the whole plan collapsed. And the next thing I know, Brandon is in charge of the department. No, I forgot a key point. That's not true. Brandon is, the fellow who had put the soaps on is let go. He was fired. And all of a sudden, entering the scene is a gentleman by the name of Michael Eisner, who is now the head of daytime. And it created a good deal of initial distress, not so much for me because I wasn't the next in line, but Brandon was. And it hurt him very much because he had been given indication that he would be the next head of daytime, and now he wasn't. And he came over with that anticipation. Eventually, we ended up working things out. And just again, I get lucky at times. I meet with some interesting people, and Michael Eisner was certainly one of them, and I learned a lot from him as well. And at a point within, I don't know, a year or so, he got promoted to the head of primetime on the West Coast, and Brandon got pushed up to the head of the department, and I became the director. So that's the way the stepladder worked. But what I do want to go back to is one thing, because we've concentrated on the soaps, and my history to a great extent is in the game show business, so I just wanted to talk about the beginnings of that. I'd never worked in games before. But at the time in which I was striving to get into the program department, and I said that I had tried to interview with Marshall and I wasn't able to do it, his staff had left, the 2 guys who were there had left. And one of them, a fellow named George Vosberg, very, very talented fellow who worked for Merv Griffin, producer, he and I were chatting, and he said, "You ought to try out for the department." He said, "You really should." He said, you got the ability. And I said, "George," I said, "I've tried. I can't get through to Marshall." He said, "Just give it, be patient." I said, "And I've never worked in game shows." He says, "I really know nothing." He says, "Oh no, you're going to be a quick learner. You'll figure it out." So that was my beginnings in game shows when I just got into the department. I had no experience in it whatsoever.
I wanted to begin to ask you about games at this time. You, in mentioning the status of the schedule, you talked about
Yeah.
two sitcom reruns,
Yeah.
which were often used in daytime in those
Mhm.
days, and you talked about serials. And do you recall in those three-ish years that you were VP of daytime at ABC, you recall any new games that you bought during those years for the first time?
During the Which period?
When you were VP of
When I was
daytime
VP?
from 74 to 77-ish.
Yeah, a couple of interesting buys.
Okay.
Um,
Because this is your first time buying game shows, I
Yes.
suppose, and becoming
Yes.
acquainted with
I had
the big-
become no, I had become more acquainted, obviously, with them through program presentations and one thing or another, and observing, looking on the air, and watching shows that I liked, and try to figure out what it was I liked about them.
Well, then let's pause and ask this, and maybe Randy can get involved here also because he has great knowledge. And when you were in these lower level daytime positions, but you were not the supreme decider, would you still be present for run-throughs and things?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
And
But remember this: that's a yes and a no. I was based on the East Coast. A lot of the activity was on the West Coast, so I was present for whatever activity took place on the East Coast. Now, Bob Stewart was on the East Coast, and so I would have dealings with Bob and some of the suppliers that were in the East. We did a show called I'm blanking on the title of it right now. It was done by Ronnie Greenberg and
Who, What, or Where?
no, Who Oughta Wear. Ronnie did Who Oughta Wear, but that was on NBC. Blah, 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 blah.
Even the Money Maze.
No, I did, and that's what I want to get to, because it involved another learning experience. There was another show that I'm forgetting the title of. It was a quiz, and it was
Big Showdown.
yes, that's it. Thank you. Showdown, Big Showdown. We had piloted that show, and it was a very, very good game with a very exciting ending. And my plan was to recommend going to air with it. We had tried a very large idea called the Money Maze. The entire studio was set up as a maze, and it had involved people trying to communicate with each other by one person on a perch overlooking the maze and the other partner of theirs in the maze running around trying to find prizes that were placed in the maze and directing them as to how to do it. It was a big idea. And I remember after the pilot, I said to myself, it's not ready. It's a big and interesting idea, but we haven't perfected the front game on this at all. We went into the scheduling room with the other. When you make a decision like this is not unilateral. You're not the king, okay? You're the head of a department, and there are other departments that are involved in the decision making that gets made. The sales department, certainly. The station clearance, the station relations department, etc. Anyone who has any interaction in trying to contribute to the success of a show, whatever area they're in, the business departments, all of those have to be on board for something to move forward and hopefully work out, because you never really know. And I went into the room and I recommended putting on Showdown and laid out the schedule and how we would use it. And my boss did something he has never done before. He was I loved Ed. He's still alive today, as far as I know, and I don't see him that often, but he was, again, a great teacher. But he was very conservative, very buttoned up, conservative executive. Nothing wrong with that, okay? It's a style. When I finished thinking we're almost done, he said, "Hey, Mike, why don't you show him the Money Maze?" And I was trapped. I said, "But it's not really." "No, let him see it." Well, the room exploded. They thought it was the best thing they'd ever seen. We have to go forward with it. And it got committed to. And in my gut, I knew it wasn't quite ready. But there we are. So the two shows went on. And I made sure that I put the Money Maze in what I call a protected position. I knew it would have great kid appeal, so we put it at the end of the schedule in the late afternoon when the kids were home from school. And it wouldn't destroy any of the rest of my shows. It might not help the affiliates in the lead into their local news, but, you know, that's life. But I knew it would play to kids, and in those days, the ABC brand was designed, which is a whole other story about how it got set up, but it was always designed to appeal to young adult and young families. That was the strength of ABC in its early days. And I knew this would play into that. And by the way, it had its effect on the decision making that I would make then and thereafter with regard to games. There are certain shows and types of shows that will play to the more traditional older audience, and some that might play to younger audiences. You never know. But I knew what elements would contribute to that possibility. So on we went with the Money Maze and Showdown. Showdown did pretty well for a couple of years, and Money Maze lasted about a year, and it didn't continue. And then I had occasion, once I took over both coasts, in essence, running all of the daytime, to be called over to Mark Goodson's office to see a show.
Is this your first acquaintanceship with Goodson?
No.
Do you
I
recall
had
when that
met.
was?
I am going to tell you the prior experience. Okay. All right. I will pause on what I was about to go to because it does need the setup. Thank you. You didn't know about this, but.
Well, Goodson being such a key figure, we'd love to know as much.
I
as
got
we
to
could.
know a lot about him. I got to watch him. And at an earlier point, we were called over to see a show. And I was really desperate to put something on the air. We had a real problem. It was a serious problem on the air with the show. So I went over with the hopes that I could even commit it to air because I know they had great execution skills, the collective of the Goodson organization. And an idea, if it was a pretty decent idea, they would do very well. But I couldn't have the authority to commit to air, so I brought my boss over with me. Well, we go in with hopes and expectations and see the run-through, and quite frankly, it didn't work. Okay? I went back into Mark's office, which was this style. You would sit down in front of Mark with the entire staff there in the room for your opinion. No pressure. And I sat there and I said to myself, what do I do? What do I do? Internal thinking. And I got an inspiration. Because I knew Mark. And I said, Mark, there's probably no one in this room who understands the problems of what we just saw better than you. But I will do this for you, with you. I'll give you a commitment for a pilot under one condition. You promise not to bring it to the stage until you think it's ready. Well, there was a hush around the room. He shook my hand, and we left. And as we were walking to the elevator, my boss says to me, "Are you crazy? What did you do?" I said, "I think it's going to prove to be the smartest thing I ever did." Turned out he was right, and I was right, but I didn't realize how. The show never surfaced again. As I said to my boss, I said, he doesn't need a pilot. With him, it's pride of authorship and success. He's not going to bring somebody to the stage that he doesn't think is ready. And he's never going to hold us to a commitment because he doesn't need it. And that's exactly what happened. Show disappeared, never was called for again, never was referred to again. But that established a working relationship between Mark and myself that was quite unique. Because he knew that I showed in public to all the staff how much I appreciated him and his skills. And didn't have to tell him, it's a pass. So I get a call later, X months later. They have something to show us. And we went over to see a show called Fast Company. It was a game of two players on a team, a pyramid format of celebrity and contestant, celebrity and contestant.
May we pause and ask, you are now VP at this point?
Yes.
Okay. In the first anecdote, you were not yet VP.
I was, but I didn't have authority to put something on the air.
Even as
I
VP,
could
you did.
commit to pilot
Okay.
without anyone else's oversight, but I couldn't commit to going on the air. Okay. So that's why my boss was there when we saw the show that blew up. Now we come where I'm in charge, and we're going over to see something with possibility of piloting it. And I go over to see it, and the front game is okay, but not special. And the end game, this was 1975. The end game, the winning team of two, was showed this list of 6 concealed answers. And I won't go through the scoring because it really is irrelevant to the story, but the question that was asked of the two players was, name somebody that most Americans hate. And I remember sitting there saying to myself, what an odd question. I've never heard anything like this before on television. Let me think about this. And what started to happen is the first of the two players says, I know who it is. It's Richard Nixon. Bing, top of the list. Second player, the devil, in sixth. Okay? A couple of other answers. And all of a sudden, the first player goes, got it, Adolf Hitler. He was third. So you had Richard Nixon, blank, and Adolf Hitler. And the place is, I mean, it's hysterical. You're trying to figure, who could possibly be between those two? Well, nobody got the answer. But what I did during the course of this back and forth, I realized very quickly that every single response was a surprise, and I emotionally reacting to it. If they said something that I had thought of, I felt good about myself. If they gave a good answer and I hadn't thought about it, that's good. We engaged in every various dynamic, right or wrong. And then they flipped number 2, and it said Howard Cosell. And the place, I mean, it was set up in part, the material. They chose the material wisely, yes. But it came out well, and it was hysterical. So I went back to Mark's office after the run-through, and with the group all there, and he said, look, this front game is okay. This end game is very special. Can't we develop a format around that material? And we talked back and forth, and the two key players of this were a fellow named Chester Feldman and Howard Felcher. They really were the key, of course, with Mark. And all of the other collective support that is there at Goodson, which was terrific. They started to fool around with it, and what they realized was, in their own practicing, that if two players play the game, whatever the question is, the first player up will have an answer, right or wrong. And the second player of the team would have an answer, right or wrong. Now you come back to the first player to get his second answer, and 50% of the time the person would blank, couldn't think of anything. Show stopped, end of game. So they realized that doesn't work. What they realized is they had to put more minds to the material. And that's how the families evolved. And that was the birth of Family Feud.
In asking you about this, your relationship to this series, once privately just chatting, I just happened to, stabbing in the dark, ask you, whose idea was it to cast this series in sort of a cornpone metaphor and have the country western music and this? And you said that was your idea.
No. Part of it was. No. The conception of the tongue-in-cheek Old West, aesthetically and stage-wise, was the staff. But Mark had a fellow named Bob Israel who did all the music for their shows. And Bob and I had known each other for even children's shows and for Bob Stewart's music, etc. And he knew that it was something that was very important to me, because I always felt that the very first emotional response an audience gets to a show is what they hear, not what they see. And so the music is very critical in establishing a mood, and you want the audience in on that quickly. So Bob called me when he said, what's this show about Family Feud? And I said, Bob, it's very simple. It's tongue-in-cheek Hatsfield and the McCoy. I said, just play with it. And I said, and you'll come up with the theme. It still lives today, same thing. They've done some reorchestration on it, but it's the same thing.
Anything you want to ask on Feud? You know many of the things about this topic, but our audience may not.
Well, I'll answer a question you may be getting to, not about how did Richard Dawson get to MC the show, because there is an interesting aspect to it.
I would like to ask you, when you, for those, because this process is repeated many times throughout your career, when one goes to see a run-through, this is not piloted, there's no set at that time.
Correct.
Is there a traditional MC in that process? And
No.
if so, who
No.
would that be?
Well, it varies. Most of the times, the producer serves as the MC.
Okay.
Depends on the individual and how they choose to want to do it or not. Sometimes there are professional MCs that host them or not. It depends on the production staff and how they want to best present their show.
So using Feud as an example, if you commit to Feud, you are committing to pilot, and therefore the network is responsible for pilot money.
Correct.
That does not come out of Goodson's pocket. Is that correct?
There is a negotiated budget for the above-the-line costs and then the below-the-line, and the network contributes the below-the-line costs. But the network is paying for the whole production.
So those productions that are more ambitious in, for example, something like The Money Maze, there are some productions that even to go to pilot, you've got to make a big commitment to the set.
Yeah.
I mean, more than Cart
That was
Sharks or
more than
something.
that. More than that, it was if you were to go to air, you were basically tying up the studio completely with that one show because there was no way you were striking and resetting that.
True. So with this in mind, when you're making arrangements for a pilot and for the budget for a pilot, how do these negotiations, this is a broad question, how do these negotiations evolve and how does one come to terms on some of these games that if you pilot them, you're making a bigger financial commitment than the average pilot because they're more elaborate games in some cases?
I can only answer to you this the way I would think about these situations because I don't think you can act responsibly as an executive if you don't take all of the issues that are going to impact a program's success or failure in mind ahead of time. Now, the above the line on the shows is fairly standardized within reason, meaning that there are usually a standard number of elements that a show requires. It depends on how many weeks they have to account for the cost of putting the pilot together, etc. So there's really not huge conflicts on that unless there's something very unusual inherent in the above-the-line elements that needs to be vetted out and discussed. If it's an item that is needed, how does it get financed? I mean, the below-the-line became a little more of a variable, depending upon the nature of the show, particularly as we began to move into the era of electronics, and to what degree those were or not a factor. And I will come back and talk about that as it relates to a show that we put on in the 80s at CBS. I'm sure Jeff was probably discussed. I could only tell you. See, what goes on, as you know, Randy, from your own experiences in this, the producers themselves are the ones who see the idea first before they present it for sale. And so they will start thinking along the lines of who could do this and do this well. And there are different skills that various MCs have, and certain formats may lend themselves more to certain MCs than others. But the network is brought to a run-through by the producers. If you're going forward and you're just now at a point that your format is together, you now want to audition for the MCs, then I will participate with the producers and seeing certain faces. Did we see an individual or two before Richard? Yes, but there was something very interesting about Richard's selection. Two interesting things. A year before the Family Feud pilot, I was doing a pilot with Peter Marshall and a fellow whose name I don't remember, who was his partner. And we were doing a show that was an interesting idea. Also, it was a little on the big side, certain aspects of it, because it involved 100 people on stage and so forth, and not as contestants, but as in some capacity. Okay, so there was a staging issue. When it came time to selecting the MC for the game, I remember Peter calling me up and saying, "Michael, I want to come in and talk to you." And he came in and he sat down in my office and he looked at me very sternly and he said, "I don't want to have any discussions about an MC." He says, "I want Richard Dawson to do the show." Now, I sat at my desk listening to him, hearing his forthrightness and knowing that he felt very strongly about this. And I said to myself, am I going to sit here and tell Peter Marshall the skills needed for an MC? If he's willing to bet his show on Richard doing it, I am not going to second guess him. Richard had been doing a show on the air around that time. I don't remember if it was on. No, he was not doing it at the time that Peter told me about this. Richard was on Match Game as a panelist, but he wanted Richard to do the pilot. So I agreed. And we were on stage doing the pilot, and there was a point in the format where the winning contestant had to be moved on camera to another part of the stage. And it was an 80-year-old granny, and Richard came over to the woman. He put his arm around her, gave her a hug, and whatever her name was, he said, "Come on, honey, come with me." And my eyes lit up, and I went, "A toucher." Richard's a toucher. I got to find a people show for Richard if this doesn't work. You know, passing thought. Boom. Okay, we do the pilot. It didn't go on the air. Business of the day occurs. You move on. You forget. I get a call from Mark Goodson as we're auditioning for Family Feud. We had seen one very well-known name who they were anxious to do the show. I'll mention the name because Joe Namath.
Yes.
Forgive me if I may pause here.
Yeah.
Had he had a background emceeing, or
No.
was this his nascent attempt?
This would be it, but they brought me over, and I saw a run-through with Joe, and he did a very credible job. There was one thing that bothered me, and it wasn't going to change. There was a certain monotone level to his voice that I just instinctively felt is not going to wear well. And I'm a little apprehensive about that. And I asked them not to keep him away, but to keep looking. Shortly thereafter, I get a call from Mark. Now, I had a good relationship with Mark, but he opened it with a line that I had never heard from him before, or ever again. Michael, I need you to do me a favor. I said, really? What? What can I do, Mark? He said, in our last contract with Richard Dawson on Match Game, he extracted a commitment from us that he would be allowed to try out as an MC for any new show that we do. So I have to ask you to come over for a run-through with Richard Dawson, but I have no great expectations. I said, okay, Mark, I'll be there. And when he hung up, I almost threw the phone at the wall. I was so angry at myself because all of a sudden the memory of Richard and being a toucher hit me again, and how could I forget that? So I went over with far different expectations than anybody there did.
Your sense is that Goodson was really only humoring him, and that he was not.
He was
very
fulfilling a
encouraged.
contractual obligation. It wasn't coming out of any great belief that this was going to be right.
When you saw him do that pilot performance or run-through performance, whatever it was.
Well,
I guess
that was a
I
run-through
guess
at that time.
run-through, of this new show, what did you think? Were you
Are you
immediately
referring to
enthused?
Feud, or are you referring back to
Feud.
the first one?
Feud? When you saw him again?
No,
doing
well,
the same
I
material?
knew he'd be right for this. I just knew it instinctively.
Mhm.
And he did a very good job in the run-through. There was no equivocation on anyone's part that I know of as to going forward with Richard. And there again, they say the rest is history. But these are, I guess, the things that an individual's empathy and instincts have to come to the fore in the process of doing your job of this kind, where you are weighing and measuring human interactions, material, how's it going to work together, all of the other elements of scoring and fairness and inequality and where the emphasis goes in the show and so forth. I mean, I'm still doing it today, working with a partner and trying to come up with new shows. But the interesting thing is that when it was time to discuss putting Feud on the air, there was no disagreement about putting it on the air, and the test results on it were good. But there was another show that the head of the department was much higher on that we go with. It was called Hot Seat, and it was done by Heater Quigley, and it was based on a gimmick, on a lie detector. It was funny, and I didn't commit to the pilot. It's a complicated story as to how that happened, which we don't have to get into, but nevertheless, I saw it for what it was, and felt that it was gimmick-oriented, and I didn't know what its sustainability might be. But our boss was in love with that. He thought it was going to be a major hit. And so we went on the air with both, and Hot Seat lasted 13 weeks, and Feud is still on the air today.
Before we move past Feud, Randy, is there anything else about the Dawson era of Feud and this era at ABC in general, the behind-the-scenes battles at Feud, anything that interests you to talk about that the audience might want to know about?
Was Shatner up for it because his wife was
I gotta-
involved politically?
I got to tell you something. If he was, I was not aware of it.
Jack Nars
Don't remember Jack's name.
and Jeff Edwards.
Jeff might have been mentioned. Again, this, as I said to you, this probably had more to do with the interactions amongst the staff, more than it hit me. They wouldn't come to me with a name unless they were prepared to go forward with it.
Do you believe that Feud was shown first to CBS?
No, I'll tell you what happened. Tell you exactly what happened. And it goes back to what I was saying about my dealings with Mark, okay? And how our bond was a very good one. We had piloted the show. Are you talking about before we saw the show first?
Yes.
That's a very good question. No, I can't give you an honest answer. There's only one thing that I do know that related to CBS, which makes me think it didn't happen, but I can't swear to it. Remember, the Goodson organization at that time, and some of the other suppliers, when they were ready to sell something, they would go to all the networks. They wouldn't just select one and wait. And you knew that you were in a competitive situation. So I cannot tell you if CBS preceded us. I tend to not think so, but then it's not something they would ever have said to me. I'm going to find out. You've raised a curiosity for me, and I know we'll know, and I'll find out.
It was going to be a companion to Match Game because of Dawson's spin-off.
Well, that would have made logical sense.
Yeah. The steal in the scoring.
Yes.
That was a big issue that the audience would be interested in.
Well, it's funny that you said that. No, wait a minute, I got distracted for a moment. When we had finished the pilot and it agreed to go to air, the fellow who was in charge of our division had problems with the format, and he asked for a meeting with Mark. And we had a big meeting in my, Mark came over with a couple of the key people that he needed with him to meet with us and my boss. And I had to let my boss speak his piece because I disagreed with him. And he was very upset with that issue of the steal. He felt that it was fundamentally unfair. You let one team go through all of these answers, and then the other team can take it with one correct answer. And he and Mark Goodson argued back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It went on. It seemed like hours, but it wasn't. It was probably about a half hour. And finally, Goodson stood up, and he looked at my boss, and he said, "We're doing it my way." And he walked up and left. But he had the ability to do that. Of course, the essence of the whole dramatic structure of the show hangs on that one element of Steal the Old Man's Bundle. A lot of these games derive out of old kids' games. So that was the story of Feud. There was one other aspect of... well, I'm forgetting at the moment, so maybe it'll come back.
What about the stories of Richard Dawson, as talented and as wonderful and as much as the audience was thrilled with him, that there were a lot of backstage difficulty?
There was personality conflict between Richard and one of the members of the staff, or key members, one of the producers. And
may we submit who this was, if I were to say, or would you prefer not to have that in the conversation?
No, I will mention it. I will mention it, and I'll try and put it in perspective, because I have great admiration and love for him. Okay, his name is Howard Felsher. Howard was he's alive and still today. We just visited him a few weeks ago, and Stu Billett and Bob and I go over to his house to see him. He's lost his eyesight, so he's not really in the greatest of shape to go anywhere. But Howard had a brilliant mind, and he was a very outspoken individual. And he did not have an edit button on his thoughts. And there we've met, each of us in our own lives, individuals who are like that, and they're very hard to deal with. And Richard was a very demanding individual himself. Sometimes some talents require more hand-holding than others. And I think that the two of them kind of just went face to face. And eventually, Howard had to be moved off the show because Richard was a big star and the show was a huge success. So that does happen on occasion.
Anything else in that area?
There's one other thing I'll mention, is you asked if there's any other shows that went on during that period.
Yes.
And there is one other one that we do not lose sight of. It's a show with a pyramid on the backstage of the board.
Now, let me ask, because
Yeah.
this show had many incarnations. Is this the first incarnation of that show?
No.
Okay.
The first incarnations, plural, were at CBS.
Okay.
And the show never had a pilot, by the way. There was a format presented, and I got this from Bob Stewart, the one who was there. There was a format presented to the head of CBS, a fellow named Bud Grant. And there were two parts to the show, and Bud worked at that time for an individual whom I then worked for at ABC, who was the one who had the big problem with the Family Feud format. And Bud found a way to deal with this fellow, which I had difficulty doing. And they decided that one part of the show was very good and the other part needed to be changed. So Bob went and revised it with two parts, one being the retented, the one that they had showed the first time, and the one he now presented to the show. And now they fell in love with the second part and wanted to get rid of the first part. And they just told him to go ahead. So he went to the stage, never really having vetted the exact format to CBS. And the pilot was made, and the show went on the air. And I remember from the first day that I saw it, when I was at ABC, seeing this go on CBS, I went to myself, this is an ABC show, it should have been here. And this goes back to the issue I was relating to with regard to the nature of the audience, the fundamental underpinnings of the networks. Their profiles were different, their audiences were a little different. And I knew that this was going to be a younger show. And it would have been younger had it played on ABC, just by nature of the inherited audience, than it would at CBS. But it was a great show. It's on the air about 8 months, 9 months.
May we ask, I know that Pyramid was emceed at one time by Cullen, and also by
Cullen did the syndicated show in the evening because Dick couldn't.
Dick Clark most famously. Was Dick
Right.
the first MC? From the
As far as I remember, he was the one
Okay.
that was on the air. I don't remember any other MC at the
Okay.
early stages. And Dick and Bob had worked before, and that's a whole other. Dick is a whole other discussion. I love Dick. He really was a wonderful, talented performer, and a great producer. So Pyramid is on the air, and it is successful. And in those days, the measure of success was about a 30 share, 30% of the available audience. And Pyramid had reached that plateau, roughly, and all of a sudden, for like a 3-4 week period, it dipped to like a 25, 26, something like that. Impulsively, the head of CBS decided this show is failing, cancel it. They were still on the air, producing shows the day that it was canceled, and I got a call from Dick Clark's agent, who said to me, "Michael, Pyramid just got canceled." And before he said another word, I said, "What?" And he said, "They're over at what is now the Colbert studio, or the Letterman studio. They're taping shows now." I said, "Dick," his name was Gary. I said, "Gary, goodbye. I'm going over there." And I marched over to the stage, just dropped everything, and I I was at 54th Street, walked over the X blocks to the studio on Broadway, walked into the control room, and my associate, who had previously worked for Bob Stewart, had heard of this and hadn't had a chance to tell me. She's in the booth, sitting there, and on her right side is a gentleman whom I didn't recognize. To her left is me. And Bob is working the show. They're still recording the show. And she looks at me and she looks at the guy and she giggles. And she turns around and to me and whispers, "I want to introduce you to the guy who's next to me." And so she turns to him and she says, "Bud, this is Michael." It was Bud Grant, whom I was my competitor at CBS, who was there to apologize for the cancellation. And his opening line to me was, "I kind of thought you'd be here." And we bought it within a day.
In the politics of the network at that time, was there no way to go back on that judgment once it was made? The judgment to cancel? Because if they had an
Are
understanding...
you asking me in that specific instance or just generally?
Well,
Because it's two
guess
different answers.
I was going to ask you generally, but we could address it however you
Generally,
wish.
anybody can undo a decision if they want to. I will tell you that I have done that. And it involves this show that we're talking about, as a matter of fact, Pyramid. So we put it on ABC, and it ran for I don't know how many years. And it was a basic show of the network, and it's still a great game. It's evidenced, just been picked up again for next year at ABC for prime time with Celebrity Family Feud. It's a great show. And the circumstance relative to the question you just asked, there was a time on CBS that I felt it needed a rest, okay? And we canceled it for a new show. And it was very painful for me to do that, not to mention painful to Bob Stewart. And the new show that we put on, within 3 or 4 weeks, I realized I'd made a mistake.
Blackout.
Yeah, a show called Blackout. And a clever idea, without question, from a very clever producer who's still a good friend of mine, who's now a feature writer. And happened, I don't know if you know, he wrote the first draft of Pirates of the Caribbean.
That has a piece of all of those films.
A fellow named Jay Wolpert.
Or Jay Wolpert, I
Yeah.
had no idea of that
Yes.
connection. So I'm assuming, but you say first draft, he didn't have the final screen credit on
In,
this.
in feature films,
Okay.
they may love your script better than anything ever in your life, but the very first thing they're going to do is do a rewrite.
Sure.
So that's that business, okay? So I realized sitting there I had made a mistake. And I confronted myself with one of two choices. Well, one of three choices. Leave the show on until I have something to replace it. But I knew that there's no way of knowing how long that's going to take. And I just couldn't leave it on if it's really not working. I could search for something new quickly, but usually when you're under pressure like that, your judgment is affected. Your anxiety level is up. Your need may lead you to make a decision that may compound the problem, not improve it. So I went with the third choice. I called Bob Stewart up and said, "I made a mistake. We're putting it back on the air." And we did.
Before we move on from ABC, allow me to please ask you two things. One is, you mentioned Clark. I would love to explore about Clark a little bit.
No, but I just want to, just for the record,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm trying to remember now if that really was at CBS or it was at ABC. I can't be sure.
Blackout?
Yeah.
CBS.
CBS, that's right. As I second thought was it was CBS. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
But you mentioned Pyramid going on the air on ABC during your tenure.
Yes, because we bought it right
Leaving
after
CBS.
it got canceled, within a year of its airing on CBS. That was in 1974, about now also around that time of Feud's beginnings, is when I think Pyramid went back on. There was almost a short gap when it went off the air on CBS and went back on at ABC within weeks.
Was this your first acquaintanceship with Dick Clark at that time, or did you have previous relationship with him?
No, I had met Dick before. You remember, Dick was we were both kind of children of ABC, although be coming from different directions.
Because of Bandstand.
And with Bandstand, and I met him all the way back when I was the VP, the assistant to the VP administration. I got to meet Dick. And
because he often had part of that Saturday morning, early afternoon-ish
right.
lineup that's kind of kids programming in a way.
It was considered that, although it was teen-oriented, but it was just part of the block.
Mm-hmm.
So those were my dealings with Dick over the years, and I always had a terrific relationship with him.
I've talked with people who worked with him or for him. Randy worked with him at the time. You have relationships working with him. An incredible craftsman-like broadcaster. His skill, because it was so fluid, it almost could be vanilla at times. It's almost subtle how good he is.
I understand what you're saying.
And it can be overlooked in that way. Having said that, almost superhuman in skill, and yet as a producer, a person, many people would say, was very tight-fisted and could be very difficult. Could you, if you agree with those characterizations, or if Randy wants to throw in, characterizing your thoughts on this man and your relationship with him, knowing these things?
Let me separate two things, a couple of things about Dick. Your assignment to him of sort of being vanilla, I know there was a calmness and a smoothness of delivery that belied his great skill.
That's right.
Okay? You know, what people don't fully understand is that a good MC is really an onstage producer. You are interacting with people and you never know what you're going to get from them. And you have to be prepared. Bob Barker was like this. He was an absolute onstage producer. And you had to be prepared for how to deal with these unanticipated situations. And the good ones were prepared to be able to do that without embarrassing someone, without upstaging them, but how to keep things moving in as smooth a fashion as you can. And Dick was brilliant at that. Bob, of course, was brilliant at it. And Bill Cullen was superb. I mean, not to take anything away from so many of the other MCs, each had their unique talents. And most of the really good ones had that ability. Dick, I'll tell you a story of an exchange that I had with Dick that spoke to his sense of self and his ability to separate his performing talent and his producing talent, and his producer mindset. I don't remember what it was we were talking about in my office one day, and I was kind of curious about something. Now, with Pyramid, he was basically an employee of Bob Stewart's. He was not an owner of the program. And whether it's because of that, it prompted my question to him when I said, I have this feeling, Dick, that you are always anxious to be on the air. And for some reason, it doesn't feel like an ego thing. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if my perception's accurate. He took a deep breath. And he said, Michael, it's an interesting insight. He said, you're right. But, he said, running a production company in a competitive environment that we live in here, in this business, you got to take advantage of every opportunity and asset that you have. And he said, I have felt that by keeping on the air, I elevate the threshold of acceptance of our production company because I am the on-air talent and do the things that I do. And so I feel the obligation to all of the people of the production company to use that asset to all of our benefits.
So in essence, what he was saying is if you want it done right, do it yourself. Or
he wasn't saying that.
The best possible talent we can hire.
He did not mean that. No. If that's what I've implied, then you shouldn't infer that.
Okay.
He was saying that his strive to be on the air was not ego-driven, not because he wanted to be on the air. He felt it was a necessity to preserve the status of his production company, to keep his name in the face of the buyers and the public.
It was that he keeps his name recognition high to sell more as a result.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And I kind of like, wow. And I had never thought of it that way. And then it made perfect sense.
There is one word you used a moment ago which cuts to the core of my perception of you. Now, you and I have a limited acquaintance, but in talking, you have perhaps some impression of me. You have some of Randy, of your friends, whomever. My impression of you, use the word measure, is as a measured person, a thoughtful person, not a bombastic person.
I would agree with that.
There are people who have done these network jobs, these executive jobs, who will knee-jerk things, who will do things for ego. Some have lasted longer than others in those positions doing that. Having said that, though, what impresses me about interacting with you is you seem to have such a thoughtful, measured quality. And your diplomacy with Goodson you talked about a moment ago, some of the other exchanges you talked about, this quality, if you could agree with my perception of you, surely has served you very well and is probably in limited supply in some of those jobs. Having said that, from whence comes that quality, in your opinion? And what do you think its role has played in your success?
Two-parter question. Right? As to what do I attribute it to? Haven't the foggiest idea. It's just part of the makeup of a person. I don't know. I know this. Early on in my observations of these jobs, I came to the realization for me that if I'm sitting in a competitive environment, and in those days there were 3 doors you could go into first, I wanted to make sure that whoever was creating a show thought of my door first, that they wanted to come into me first. That required sensitivity in handling people, knowing how to say yes and no. Saying yes is easy. Saying no is hard. And saying no in a constructive way, and find a way in order to maintain that respect and relationship. Because I had enormous respect for almost every one of the talents that would come to me with these shows. I remember it even in a little different way. There were times in which some of the more senior members of the industry would come into my office, and they'd always come in with this very guarded, I would sense that they have a very guarded feeling about it. There's a certain discomfort they're feeling. And so and a little chip on their shoulders at a time. And I kind of called it on one of them, and I just said, look, come on, what's going on here? There's something going on under an underpinning that I'm sensing in my sensitivity to this, and I want to know what it is. And one of them just said to me, we rarely come in and get a chance to come in and talk to you guys anymore. Nobody knows, nobody pays attention to us. You know, we're like has-beens. And I said, you're crazy. That's never going to happen here. You guys went through this. Why would I stupidly not want to have you in this office and learn from your own experiences? I may agree or disagree with you, but I'd like to hear what they were. And if you got an idea, by all means, you're going to have an office. And that kind of spread a little bit. And so that kind of established, I guess, a mutuality of respect, understanding one's positions and empathizing with that of those who were on the other side of the table. I will tell you a story related to this, as it didn't relate to any individual of any specific status. It was an employee of mine who was very bright, and he was starting to what I call misbehave and abuse the privilege of his position. And I called him in the office, and I said, so-and-so, I've watched you, and I said, you got some real promise. You're a bright young person, and I think you have a big career ahead of you. I just want to point out something to you. You're beginning to behave as if you believe that the power is in your rear end. And it's not. It's in the chair. And you're a temporary occupant of a permanent position. And the day's going to come when you're on the other side of the table. So I want you to think about how you would feel if you were receiving behavior like you're giving the people on the other side. Think about it. It's your choice. Do what you want. But I think I have a responsibility to point that out. And it goes to that very issue. Understanding that when you are in the buyer's chair, you are the buyer. You're not the producer. You may disagree with what the producer wants to do, and you have a responsibility to start to discuss it with them and hopefully have some constructive suggestions, not just negative ones. That's part of the learning process. But the sensitivity about that dynamic, you sort of have to have inside of your head. You have to understand that.
Before we move on to NBC, let me check lighting. Do you want to pause or anything?
Well, there was a second part to your question.
I thought that was your second. I thought
Well,
the
maybe
first
that's
part
it.
was. I thought the first part was the why.
Where did it
you
come
are-
from?
Where it come from?
And did it affect? I guess.
But
Okay.
if you-
I guess I did answer the
But
second
if you
part.
could, because I think it's integral. If you have
Yeah.
more to share on that, I'd love to know what it is.
No, I was just saying. But when you asked about the first part, I remember at a time I was being interviewed to go from ABC to NBC in the late 70s. And I was being interviewed by the fellow then who was in charge of the entertainment division at NBC, a fellow named Paul Klein, who had been the head of their research department before that, and an interesting character, very interesting, very bright character. And I met him at some restaurant up in Westchester County, I think it was, on a Saturday afternoon. The place was virtually empty. I'd not met him before. And I walked into the place, and there's a guy sitting there who I first glance dismissed. It couldn't be he, because he was not the most elegantly dressed individual in the world. And I walked over and I said, "You Paul?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "I'm Michael." And we sat down with a couple of niceties. And he said, "I've heard a lot about you." He said, "What do you consider the keys to your success? What do you think has made you a success?" And I sat back and I said to myself, wow. In instantaneous self-evaluation. Toughest question I've ever been asked, but the right question. And I obviously answered it well enough because he hired me. But it goes to those issues that I just talked about understanding the importance of how to deal with the diversified creative talents that are in this business. And there are many, and they're all different. And I know there are times in which I would be measuring an idea for a show with regard to the nature of the producing entity. And did I think there was compatibility between the two? Is it an idea that I even think this producer is going to be able to fully realize? Those are just some of the dynamics of doing those jobs.
Anything else ABC related you want to ask?
Well, did you know Chuck Barris
Yes.
when he was working for the network?
Yes.
Can you reflect a little bit on that?
I remember one of my early friends and I walking down, I think it was 6th Avenue, but I'm not sure what avenue it was, with Chuck Barris dressed in a suit, in a shirt, in a tie, very different from the imagery that he evolved to. He was an executive at ABC. He worked, in fact, under the fellow who I reported to, Ed Vane. He was a director of daytime, Chuck. And I just found him to be a hoot. He was very funny. You know, he was a composer. He wrote a very popular song of the day called Palisades Park. And he was just an interesting, and how he got his job was an interesting one, too. This would have been somewhere in the 60s. Had to be, yeah. Chuck had come in for an interview with a fellow who was running ABC Daytime at the time, a fellow named Jerry Chester, who eventually was the number 2 person at the Mark Goodson organization for many years, a very close friend of mine. And he told me that Chuck had come in for an interview, and he found him interesting, and Chuck was up from Philadelphia, which is where he was from, but he just didn't have a job for him. Within a couple of months, the payola scandal erupted. And Jerry realized there they were sitting with American Bandstand in Philadelphia, unsupervised, in the midst of this chaos. He felt they were vulnerable. Not that he was in any way assuming that there was a problem. He didn't want it to be a problem. And he remembered Chuck, who had come from Philadelphia. Perfect marriage. He hired Chuck to be the overseer of American Bandstand. And then he eventually got in as the director of daytime.
Because he has mentioned it, I'm sure you've been asked about this, but it's for the record because it has been mentioned. What Chuck Barris left us only recently, and
Yes.
of course, upon doing so, the question again was raised of his very bizarre claims surrounding his activities outside.
There is nobody who would ever thought of making that claim and thinking it might be believable other than Chuck Barris. He was a hoot. He had a smile and a look in his eye. He was a devil. He was he was devilish, is the way I would phrase it. And he was a fascinating guy, walking around, scratching his head, talking. His mind is working. Just a fascinating guy, absolutely fascinating.
So his bizarre claims of being a CIA agent, et cetera, you think that's complete silliness?
I think it was typical of Chuck to try and pull off something like that. Now, do I think it was true? I doubt it. But I can't say for absolute certainty it wasn't. But it doesn't ring true for me.